Why should you read Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe? Well, because they're amazing books. These are technically 4 books originally, now collected in 2 volumes. 4 of the greatest novels ever written, combining into one of the great cycles, one of the greatest cycles ever written by a great author, really an author's author, much like Norm Macdonald might be said to be a comedian's comedian. Gene Wolfe turns out to be one of those authors' who's recommended as really an absolute kind of number 1, number 2 writer by many other writers. In some ways it's easier to say, though, because I could say, oh, I like this or this or this. In some ways it might be easier and fairer to start with saying, why shouldn't you read Book of the New Sun? Because it feels like, well, they're not incredibly popular books in a mass sense. And it feels like when you hear people say, I didn't like these books, you're like, yeah, I can see what you're saying. People will say, he's a tough writer to read, is Wolfe. And when you get down to brass tacks, it's often not that someone's saying, oh, I thought his writing was really bad, per se, or that I hated everything about this or this or this, but that Wolfe he trusts his audience so much that he refuses to make it easy for you to grasp what's going on. He has so many things to do, often which involve textual tricks, that he trusts you to make the effort and to work it out without him hand-holding you. There are many good authors who have a very different style, someone like Brandon Sanderson, who still pulls off twists and things like that, but nonetheless, he is very direct, that his structure and his plotting and so on are, for all their Sanderlanches kind of conclusion drama, they're pretty direct and simple books in terms of the real meta stuff, whereas for Wolfe, the meta stuff is so big, so much of what's really being said is a layer or 2 behind the text, in the structure and in the implications of what's going on and in the tiny clues spread throughout. He's also, and this is really a spin out from that, the stories he tells are often very strange and very out of view and coming from left field, and you're just not really sure what's going to happen and why it's happening and how this world even works. Not just are you confused to begin with, but even as you pick stuff up, you end up realizing this makes it even stranger. There are moments of just genuine confusion and realizing that the worlds and the things he wants to talk about are, even once you've begun to grasp them, very, very strange and in that sense alienating. But I think that he is well worth the effort. So here's a lot of effort, and if you don't like lots of effort, there are particular things people don't like about one novel or another, or one character or another. If you ever research any of his books, you'll find out what they are. But really the big thing is, he's a lot of effort. You've got to be willing to, in these books for instance, deal with a lot of vocabulary that he has invented or appropriated from the Greco-Roman world and put into this context of this strange world, this strange version of Earth, and it's not always clear whether the thing he's talking about is like what the word seems to imply or not. That's a very simple example, but I know some of my viewers have found that very hard when we've talked to Wolfe before. They've said that was really rough. So those reasons not to read it, but I think it is worth reading it, his stuff, and I think he is worth the effort and rewards the effort, and his trust in readers is rewarded. And as to the Book of the New Sun particularly, I think I'd want to say that what you have here is a book that, in terms of its structure, its writing, its plotting, its world building, and its character building and arc, is symphonic. Each of those things is an instrument or a group of instruments. Each of them has particular roles. Each of them draws on the same motif at a different time. You get a motif drawn through the characters that comes up in the world building that comes out in some trick of the writing, and it does it all perfectly. It does it all in a perfectly symphonic way, and it's really virtuosic in its scope and excellence in executing that. Because all those things are things Wolfe is good at. World building is something that over the 4 books he slowly reveals things about the strange world, where Severian, a torturer's apprentice, ends up getting into a dramatic situation which involves him going across the world. And so he sees lots of the world, and we find out lots of the world, and many of the most important things about what's actually happening in the world you get in the 4th book, but they're always there. They start with you seeing the city of Nessus, so you learn about Nessus, and your scope changes with Severian's scope as really he ages and grows up effectively in the book. And so you see more and more, and you understand more and more of this strange world and how it fits into our world and everything else. Why is it a sort of almost Byzantine culture in a part of what seems like our world, perhaps, but doesn't seem to be in Greece or America or Britain or whatever? It seems to be somewhere else. The geography is unfamiliar, but also there's all these strange leavings and remnants of something else, of another culture, in which people live. They live in the ruins of other cultures and are surprisingly incurious about it, because there's just so much other stuff. It becomes, every day. And then you have Severian, this character, and the character, there's lots of character work on lots of characters, for those who know the books. Jonas and Thecla are very good examples. The old Autarch, and a few others, Dorcas particularly, Talos and Baldanders, all of them. That's a big cast of supporting characters, Jolenta, who have amazing depth and different things going on in them, which is very enjoyable. They're really well executed, but Severian is the heart of it. He is, there we see him, and these nice covers by Laura Brett, and he is a young man, an 18-year-old or so, when he goes on his adventure, and he does not know it, but he is crashing between all these different strange locations on a picturesque journey where coincidences keep happening. He keeps misunderstanding what's going on. You, the audience, don't always know what's happening. Scenes seem to be missing in his life. He's from a traumatized background as as an orphan, going to the torturers and being raised by the torturers, but he seems to have high motives, but then he seems also other times perhaps to do quite bad things, and yet there is this thing, you also see what happens and the change brought upon him as he comes into contact with functional people, with functioning community, and you see this pilgrim's progress across the world of this broken man, and the changes that are wrought in him by it. And it's a very, very compelling story, I think. It's beautifully put together. It's often confusing. Severian is a complex narrator. He might be said to be an unreliable narrator. There's an interesting point Neil Gaiman makes about Wolfe, that you can trust him implicitly, but you also can't trust him as far as you can throw him. I tend to hold to the theory about, and this is the majority theory about Severian, that there's always some degree of truth and accuracy in what he says, but for one reason or another, to do with whether it's sanity or deception or something else, you don't always know what's really happened, and you have to work out what the truth is, how the thing he said is true, because it probably is, but it might not be true in the way that Severian thinks he's telling you it's true. So it's a story of an incredibly compelling, broken character on a journey where he hopes to become better. He hopes to become more than he was. He learns about the world, and about how the world isn't what he expected, and how the politics and philosophy of politics of the world is much deeper and stranger and wider and higher than he expected, and he takes vital part in that story. The writing is terse, short, effective, but often also very decorated. There's an incredible skill in writing tersely and elliptically without saying too much, but which still has a very high descriptive quotient, a great ability to give you a lot of information about the world if you're paying attention. And the story is one which starts from the frankly baffling and intentionally baffling, why has Severin got into the situations he's getting into, and it develops into this you think it's going to be one kind of story, but then it's this picaresque drama, but then the story you thought it was going to be transmutes into something else, and strange things keep happening, and Severin keeps finding himself in the heart of strange situations and meets all kinds of people, and that brings him all the way to his destiny, to where he's going from the start of the story, really, in many ways. The story is not a story that resolves itself neatly and ties things up with a bow. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it doesn't do that. It ties some things up and it points forward to some things. There is a sequel or coda called The Earth of the New Sun, which is wasn't written at the same time and isn't necessary reading, but most people would say, wow, you should really move on to that. Not everything is resolved by the end of the fourth book, Citadel of the Autarch, which is actually in this one. But we understand the stakes of what's happening, we understand what Severin has accomplished or has not accomplished so far, and we see what's going to happen next, where he's going next, what the point of this is. And that is intricately woven from page one. And to some degree that's a process of revision. Wolfe was was a very skillful expander and reviser of these stories in particular. But yes, that's that he gets away with it. He works out the things that need to happen early on, and everything draws together. And as I say, it draws together through the world building, through the character, through the terse writing. And one thing I should say about the terse writing is that it's not necessarily, it has moments of real beauty, but say compared to Lovecraft, who I reviewed recently, there are a couple of passages in Lovecraft when he's not trying to be creepy and weird. He's very good at that. But there are a couple of passages of such power and beauty in Lovecraft, and Wolfe doesn't tend to do that very often. Rather, there is just this clarity of what he's saying that draws to mind what's going on, gives you extra hints and tips, and is so very clear about what is going. Well, it's not always clear about what's going on. It's very clear about the things it wants to communicate to you. I'll just read the first paragraph, I suppose, as an example of this. It is possible I already had some presentiment of my future. The locked and rusted gate that stood before us, with wisps of river fog threading its spikes like the mountain paths, remains in my mind now as the symbol of my exile. That is why I have begun this account of it with the aftermath of our swim, in which I, the torturer's apprentice Severian, had so nearly drowned. The guard has gone, thus my friend Roche said to Drota, who had already seen it for himself. Doubtfully, the boy Yatta suggested that we go around. A lift of his thin, freckled arm indicated the thousands of paces of wall stretching across the slum and sweeping up the hill until at last they met the high curtain wall of the citadel. It was a walk I would take much later. So you can see there's no great open explosives. There's a couple of quite powerful and fresh metaphors or similes, descriptive items, and there's a quick establishment of the situation of these boys who've been out for a swim. You get a hint of Severian's character, that he says things roundabout or in an odd way. He says, I did this, and this is the symbol of my exile. I won't say what my exile is or what that means, but I need to start my story about it, so I'll do it here. Oh, by the way, I just almost drowned. And you can see this thing about Severian too. There's a great citadel, there's a great graveyard, there are guards, there are torturers. You have this world established in its first great stroke of the pen, or first two strokes of the pen, to create the outline. And so it is throughout all of that. It's incredibly powerful stuff, incredibly important stuff, incredibly humane stuff, a real passion for understanding the human heart and for explaining some of the revolutions and changes in the human heart. So that's why I think you shouldn't or should read the Book of the New Sun. If that sounds like it's worth the effort of... one thing is you can just read it and take a wild ride and be baffled and just enjoy the things that are easily enjoyable on the first time through and just let that settle. And I think probably I've certainly had moments in reading these books where I've done that. The same with the other Solar Cycle books by Wolfe I've read, and indeed the other non-Solar Cycle book by Wolfe I've read. There are moments where you just have to go with the flow and maybe come back, or listen to one of the many podcasts about it, or read about it online. But if you're willing to make the effort to sometimes kind of get a grip and work out what's going on, and work out what a word must mean in the context, even though it's a bizarre word you've never heard before, and to engage with this strange, potentially insane character, main character, who's telling you stuff and is the only person you get to hear telling you stuff, it seems. If that sounds worth it for the result I've offered of this great symphony that comes to a beautiful conclusion, then I would strongly recommend you read the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. If you have read it and liked it or disliked it, tell me why, tell us why in the comments, and I will see you next time.